And so all Israel will be saved, he says, as the scriptures say. The one who rescues will come from Jerusalem and will turn Israel away from ungodliness. And this is my covenant with them, that I will take away their sins. And so not only a regathering of national Israel is predicted, but like here, there is also a spiritual awakening, a realization toward the end of history by vast numbers of Jews that Jesus was the Messiah after all. And he says in Zechariah, they will look upon me whom they have pierced and weep as though for an only son. There's going to be an incredible spiritual event in Israel. Hasn't happened yet, that's for sure. Although we do see already unprecedented numbers of Jews becoming completed Jews. The Messianic Jewish movement is bigger today than it's ever been in history. I know a number of you are Jewish here. And when Jews realized Jesus is the one that we were looking for, we missed that. They realized that Jesus is the completion of everything Jewish. He is the one that corresponds to where this whole thing was headed. Was to the sacrificial lamb. Why were people making sacrifices at the temple all those years? How could animals really forgive humans? It was all a picture. It was all pointing forward to something. And that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that the Old Testament teaches. And so we can anticipate that there's going to be a huge spiritual awakening in Israel yet to come. Well, he says, many of the people of Israel are now enemies of the good news, and this benefits you Gentiles. And yet, they're still people he loves because he chose their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. And that statement there, the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable, is a clear statement that covenant that God made with Abraham is permanent. Just like we saw in Isaiah there, it will never be revoked. And all people who are the most wrong about this are Christian theologians. I speak as a small minority among Bible teachers when I say that the Jews are still God's people, and that nothing has changed on that. Let's try to draw a few conclusions here, okay? The first one is obvious. God has not forgotten or rejected the Jews. In the first and second centuries, Christians and Jews came to blows. And Christians were under persecution. They were an illegal religion in the Roman Empire, whereas Judaism was a legal religion because it already existed when the Romans conquered Israel. And their rule was, if you're already there when we get there, then it's okay. But you can't start any new religions. Now, of course, Christianity is really not a new religion. It is Judaism. Christianity is Judaism, properly understood. That's the way we view it. Well, the Romans didn't view it that way, and the Jews were making sure these are not a sect of Judaism. This is a whole new religion. And so they actually led the charge against the early Christians. The result, bitterness. And by the end of the 200s AD, we can track the rise of a searing anti-Semitism. As we read the writings of the early church fathers, they began to hate Jews. This passage that we just read was ignored, systematically ignored by the early church. And they formulated these new theologies that had God rejecting the Jews forever. And then, when the Christians finally came into the ascendancy under Constantine, the first thing they did was begin to legislate against Jews. The Theodosian Code, written a few years after Constantine, just went right down the list. It forbade Jews from owning property. They were not allowed to own land. The tallest Jewish synagogue in any city had to be shorter than the shortest Christian church. the Jews' word didn't count for anything in court. And so on it went. And they were persecuting legal measures passed against the Jews. And this is what set up a scenario for anti-Semitism to flourish. People throughout Europe in the succeeding centuries would be like, what is it with the Jews? We work the soil, we are farmers, we work for a living. They never farm, They dress different than us. And of course nobody ever bothered to look back and say, oh, well, we passed a law that they're not allowed to own them. And so they were forced into the merchant business and into money lending, because the church would not allow its own people to lend money. That was against their rules. But Jews were allowed to lend money at interest. And so they were the only ones allowed to do it. Well, commerce needed money. Petty nobles needed money at times, and the only place to get it was to borrow it from a Jew. That became an institution in Europe. And as a result, that added to people's bitterness towards Jews, because the interest rates were pretty high, and it was backed usually by the army of the local baron. Would put his army out there to enforce collection of these loans, sometimes at 100 and 200% interest per year. Well, if you couldn't afford to pay back your loan, then your land was forfeit. You got foreclosed. Of course, Jews can't own land. That's against the law. So who gets the land? The baron. This is how nobles used the Jews to create the nation states in Europe. It's a very interesting history to study. People were all over Europe who lost their houses and their lands in their mind, to Jews, although the Jews were really being manipulated by nobles who were using them to grab a larger kingdom for themselves. That contributed to this belief in Europe that the Jews, they don't go out and work for a useful living. They just are like parasites that sap our blood away and take our stuff. And that kind of belief system, which was all set up by the Christian church, so-called Christian church, is really the milieu and the belief system that guys like Hitler came out of. Throughout the medieval period, Jews were bitterly persecuted, including torture and death in the thousands by the medieval church in the name of Jesus. Some accounts are so wild. Things like this just don't even happen. Where in Passau, they herded 5,000 men, women, and children into their very large synagogue there, barred the doors, and burned it down with them inside. Slaughtered everybody. And they would do these things because they believed, for instance, that the Black Death, the Black Plague, was being caused because Jews were secretly poisoning the wells. Stuff like that. It's all a huge error. In Revelations 12, we read that the dragon realized he'd been thrown down to earth. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. I don't have time to back this up, but the dragon in this story is Satan. And the woman who had had a child was Israel. This verse teaches that the real agent, the fomenter, the stimulus for international anti-Semitism on earth is Satan. He hates the Jews. And that ought to be a lesson. If you're a Christian here tonight, you should consider that. If you ever engage in any kind of anti-Semitism, you're doing Satan's thing. He's the one that wants to see that happen. In the Old Testament, when God made his covenant with Abraham, he says, Abraham, those who curse you, I'll curse. It's totally bad news to go against the Jews because they are God's people and he protects them.